This is Kay Rudolph with the third and final part in this series based on John Colletta's article, Tracking a Loner on the Move, W Parberry Exposed by the Genealogical Proof Standard. This was an article that was published in the June 2005 edition of the National Genealogical Society's Quarterly. It's an excellent overview of the process of preparing a research plan and conducting that plan. In the first part, we follow John's process of collecting information about J.W. Parberry, who had been a witness at a fire related to John's ancestors. And we focused on the latter half of Parberry's life, collecting records that would then help us to identify him in his home environment with his parents. The second episode then took that information that we had gathered, used those clues to identify Parberry with his wife in 1860, and then with his family and earlier censuses. This third part looks at Parberry's wife, finding out what happened to her after the Civil War, and working to identify her origins. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to assess the information that we have collected in previous research. What have we learned about James Wood Parberry? Well, we have the marriage record from November 1851 showing that James W. Parberry married Nancy McMurray in Barron County, Kentucky. On that record, the marriage bonds, we see that Joel Irwin served as bondsman, and the 1860 census lists Nancy Parberry, age 23, born in Kentucky, in a household with James, age 31, as well as 3 children, a John, 5, a George, 3, and a Tyler, who was 4 months old. All children were born in Kentucky. So, of course, the first thing that we think of doing is looking for Nancy in the 1850 census. She married in 1851 in Barron County, so we would expect to find her in Barron County the year before, 1850. And so I've set that as my search terms. And we have actually, as the first result, Nancy M. Murray, but we see Joel Irwin as one of the householders, so we recognize him from the marriage bond. Let's take a closer look. Joel Irwin is 29 years old. He's a farmer with $500 and born in Kentucky. Helen, his wife, we assume, though it's not necessarily so. Helen Irwin, an unidentified female, it could be his sister or his wife, 30 years old. And then we have Nancy, this is actually Muck M.C. Murray, 18, and a John Anderson, age 12. We don't want to draw any assumptions, but our thoughts are from Joel Irwin being a bondsman in Nancy's marriage, we expect that relationship to be fairly close, and we wonder perhaps if Helen might be her sister and Joel is her brother-in-law. So we're forming these hypotheses in our mind at this stage, and we're going to be thinking about ways that we can use that information to identify records for Nancy and to identify her origins. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out here, and that is Nancy's age. Here in the 1850 census, she's listed as 18 years old, suggesting a birth year of 1832. But in the 1860 census, she was listed as 23 years old for an estimated birth year of 1837. Now, it is possible that one of those is an error, or it's possible that the enumerator in copying the census in order to send in the federal copy, which is what we're looking at. We're not looking at the original that the census taker carried around with him. We're looking at a copy. It's possible that the census taker had written Nancy M. McMurray, age 13, and written the 3 in such a way that it appeared to be an 8. Or it's possible in the 1860 census that the same thing happened, but reversed, that the enumerator carrying the sheets around had written 28, but it had been misread as 23. 3 and 8s can frequently be mistaken. So there is some question about when Nancy was born. We want to keep both those hypotheses in mind because we don't have enough information yet to settle that question. So our next question is going to be, where was Nancy after the war? And we're going to look for her in the 1870 census. I'm keeping the search very simple. Nancy Parberry with a birthplace in Kentucky. I am not putting anything in for an estimated birth year because of the questions that I have from the 1850 and the 1860 census. And besides, I feel like her name is unusual enough that I don't expect to find a whole lot of confounding results. If I was looking for a Mary Smith, then I would certainly want to add some more information because I would expect to get too many results back. But in this case, my bet seems to have worked fairly well. I only have one Nancy Parberry. I have a bunch of Barbers and variations on that, but only one Nancy Parberry. Let's take a closer look. She's born in Kentucky, but she's residing in Alabama. Here we have her household. Now, here she's 38, which would fit in with the hypothesis of her being 18 in 1850, 28 in 1860. She's listed as keeping house, and she has with her a 12-year-old child. Now that would match the George, who was 3 years old in the 1860 census. But we don't see the 2 other children. Now it's possible that the children may have died in the interim between 1860 and 1870. The war was a difficult time. This looks like it is her. The probability of there being 2 women named Nancy Parberry who were 38 years old and had a son, George, aged around 12, 13, born in Kentucky, we have too many unusual events to make that hypothesis feasible. So we are looking at Nancy. She is heading the household of her own. She appears to have 3 other adults living with her. They are 2 day laborers and a domestic servant. Now it's not clear whether these are people who are boarding with her or people who are working for her. But she appears to be living as an independent woman in Montgomery, Alabama. Now looking for her in the 1880 census, I decided to use a few wild cards just to narrow my focus so I didn't get a whole bunch of Barbers. And so I've used the question marks to take the place of the first 2 letters in her name. The 3rd and 4th letters I wanted to be an R and a B, and then I wanted her name to end with an RY. I've given a very wide distribution for her birth year because even though she's been fairly consistent, given our hypothesis of the misreading of the 1860 census when it was copied, and it looks like she was consistently born 1832, so we don't know who the enumerator spoke with. He might have spoken to a neighbor who thought she looked a lot older than she was, or thought she looked a lot younger than she was. So I gave myself a broad range. If I got too many results, I could always tighten it down. We only get one result, actually, that's an exact match for Nancy Parberry, born 1832 in Kentucky, and she is living now in Chattanooga, Hamilton County, Tennessee. Let's take a closer look. Let's make it a little larger. Nancy Parberry, white female, age 48. That's in line with 48 in 1880, 38 in 1870, 28 in 1860, and 18 in 1850. And she is ahead of her household again, as she was in Montgomery in 1870. Here she's working as a seamstress. She has one person living with her. It looks like a Mrs. Julia Shelton, age 28, and a child, Clay Shelton, age 7. Our Nancy was born in Kentucky, of parents born in Kentucky. Julia and Clay are born in Tennessee with no additional information provided about them. So is this James's wife? Well, let's take a look at the information that we know and see how it matches up across the different records we have. We have James Parberry's wife from the 1851 marriage record and the 1860 census and the 1850 census. The name Nancy Parberry is consistent across all the censuses. The birthplace is consistent across all the censuses. The birth year is consistent if we accept that idea that there might have been an error in the 1860 census, but it's definitely consistent with the 1850, the 1870, and the 1880. For children, there is George, born in Kentucky in 1856-57, matching the 1870 census of George, born 1857 or 58 in Kentucky. The occupation, head of household in both these later censuses. In one case, keeping house. In the second, seamstress. There's no other Nancy Parberry at all born in the 1830 to 1835 period in Kentucky in any census at all. So it's looking very strong that this is her. There's still a couple of other things that we can do to confirm this. A reasonably exhaustive search. We're going to look for possible family, associates, neighbors, friends in pages before and after Nancy on that 1870 census. We're going to check Kentucky and Alabama state censuses. Look for any divorce records in Kentucky or Alabama for her divorce from James Parberry. We'll check Montgomery County land records to see if there is a paper trail there, and we'll check city directories. Now, the 1870 fans, when Colletta searched, he found that there were no neighbors named Parberry, McMurray, or Irwin, no neighbors from Kentucky at all within 5 pages of Nancy. And none of the other Kentucky natives who lived in the same ward that Nancy lived in match any of the names in the Parberry's 1860 neighborhood. And that included 10 whites, 2 blacks, and 4 mulattoes. What about state censuses? Well, a check of the Kentucky article in the Family Search Wiki indicates there are no Kentucky state censuses in this period. There is an Alabama state census for 1866, and so we did a search for Nancy Parberry, leaving all other search fields blank, but we don't get anything that is remotely close to her. When we look at these, they are clearly not our Nancy. Do we find a divorce record? Well, let's go to the wiki and look at the article on Kentucky, Vital Records, and see what they have to say about divorce records and about accessing them. In most cases, divorces from 1792 to 1849, nope, that's not of interest. In 1849, authority was given to county circuit courts to grant divorces. These records can be requested from the clerk of the county court. Some circuit clerk offices may have records as early as 1802. The Family History Library has divorce records from some Kentucky counties. These records may be found under court records or vital records of the individual county. So what Colletta did is he went and he looked at the court records for Barron County and checked to see if there were any divorces recorded for Nancy and James Parberry. Colletta also looked at the wiki article on Alabama divorce records, since Nancy may have had her divorce after leaving Kentucky. And this article tells us that in the early 1800s, the legislature, the circuit courts, and city courts granted divorces. So there's 3 possible places the divorce could have taken place. There is a link to a collection. Alabama divorces were settled in county chancery courts until 1915. The state legislature was also empowered to authorize divorce decrees. So we're going to want to look at county chancery court records as well as private acts of the state legislature. And this later is telling about after 1915. A lot of interest to us. We have the microfilms, county divorce reports 1818 to 1829. We have records available through the Alabama Department of Archives and History, arranged by year and county. We'll want to follow up on that website. We have a publication with divorce records for 1818 to 1868. Now that's available at the Family History Library, but is it also available at other libraries? Let's look for this book using WorldCat. A search for the title Alabama Divorces 1818 to 1868 by Marilee Beatty Hagenes. Turns out this particular book is available at our local genealogy library not 20 miles away. So don't assume that if there is a book listed in the Family History Library that you have to travel to Salt Lake City to look at it. There may be copies available locally. So after all of that research on divorces, John Colletta found no divorce records at all for the couple. That's not entirely surprising. At that time period, folks weren't necessarily sticklers for getting the paperwork done. There was less of a paper trail being followed than there is today. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a couple to simply split apart. Now we saw that Nancy did not remarry, so she may not have felt a compulsion to get a divorce if she was happy staying as a single woman. What about land records? Well, of course, the first thing that I would do would be to go take a look at the Family Search Catalog, do a search for Montgomery County, Alabama, and scroll through and take a look at their land and property collections. Here we have Montgomery County, Alabama deed records. I would open this up, and this would be exactly what I'm looking for. Unfortunately, these are not yet digitized and available online. Until recently, I would have ordered one of these microfilms, but they are no longer offering that service. So my options at this moment are to visit Salt Lake City or Montgomery County, to hire somebody to do the lookups for me, to wait until these microfilm are available online. But I'm going to do one more thing. Sometimes these are available through other websites. So I'm going to do some searching to see if there's another way that I can access these records. Of course, we can check the wiki, and we would also want to take a look at Google and doing a search, Montgomery County, Alabama Public Records. We get a couple of sites. The Montgomery County, Alabama Free Public Records Directory. This publicrecords.onlinesearches.com is a useful compilation site where they've collected information from a variety of sources on where you can access records. So let's do a search through that. We have archival land and lot books, view Montgomery County Revenue Commissioner's archived land and lot books. Well, let's take a look at that. The earliest date is 1889. Now, we have her living in Chattanooga in the 1880 census. But I just wanted to take a look and see what these records were and what they looked like. This is a list of lands subject to taxation in Montgomery County for 1889. So this is a record collection that I wasn't aware of. So as you're doing your research, you're going to stumble across sources that you're going to want to tuck away for future use. Continuing on at this public online record search site, we find recorded document search Montgomery County recorded documents by name or volume and page, including land records, archive probate records, and marriage records. Well, let's take a look at that. And so this opens the Montgomery County probate judge website, and we have the sidebar here, probate records search, record and recording forms. I'm looking for something like land records, or so I want to see if there is something on this website that might help me quickly focus in on record collections that would be useful for genealogical research. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to do a site search for the terms genealogy or genealogical or the phrase family history. I construct that by putting my series of search terms followed by site, colon, and the stub for the website. You'll see up here, this website is www.mc-ala.org/elected officials, probate judge, probate resource, pages. So I copied just that leading section there and insert that. When I say site, colon, and a main web page like this, Google is going to search it's going to search through all pages that have this stub in their URL. So you can see here it's looking through the subdirectories and subfolders. We have 3 results: probate record search, record and recording, Montgomery County Employee Health Plan. Now that last one is family history, but not the kind that we're interested in. We open the page on records and recording, scrolling down, reviewing the information that they provide to us. They note here to view the record indexes online. That's possible with no charge. Unfortunately, Access to the records is available only through their subscription. To see whether that would be worthwhile pursuing, we continue reading, and we learn here that real property documents are only indexed in the computer system from June 1970 to the present. John Colletta went through and did what had to be done. After doing all of that, found no deeds or other land records. And this isn't anything different from our frequent dead ends. So if you sometimes feel like you're the only one who's searching and searching and searching and finding nothing, no, this is just part of the game. So what about city directories? She was living in Montgomery, Alabama and Chattanooga, Tennessee. Both of those are urban areas, so let's see if we can find city directories for that time period. Again, we go back to that family search wiki. So looking at the article on Montgomery County, Alabama genealogy, there is a link to a website, Montgomery County, Alabama Online Historical Directories. Let's take a look at that. I'm looking for something that would be in the 1860, 1880 period. By 1880, she's already living in Chattanooga, so I don't see anything here early enough to meet my needs. Going back to the wiki, we have here a mention of an 1878 version available on Ancestry. Let's take a look at that. She may still have been in Montgomery County in 1878. Going and doing a page-to-page search in that directory, looking at the P's, we would expect Parberry to be in here. We don't see it. I am fairly confident that in most cases, city directories are fairly good about getting names spelled correctly because that's where their money is. And if they have a reputation for misspelling names so that you can't be found in the directory, you're not likely to subscribe to it. Going over to Ancestry's collection of U.S. city directories for Chattanooga, we see several entries for a Nancy Parberry in that period that we're looking at. And notice here, her spouse is listed as J.W. Parberry. Let's take a look at the directory page itself. And here we see her listed, Nancy Parberry, WID, JW, RWS, Walnut, N of 5th. There's a number of abbreviations in there, but I am guessing that that means Nancy Parberry, widow of J.W. Now it's interesting that we know that J.W. is not dead at this time. Nancy is continuing to live as a single woman. It is not surprising, since she is known to have children, that she would list herself as being a widow. Divorce was still considered to be a negative thing, and so people tended to hide that fact or lie about it. Some of those abbreviations may be unfamiliar to you. In that case, go to the beginning of the directory and thumb through until you find this table of contents that will direct you to the abbreviations listed here on page 77. We go there and we can see here WID is widow and the R is her residence, so we can translate the information from the entry. So what were Nancy's origins? We have taken her now to Chattanooga, where she's been a seamstress, and from looking at the directory entries, we can see that she resided there at least until 1886. Our question now is, can we get any information about her origins? Can we learn more about her before 1850? Now, I did a search for McMurray's in Barron County in 1850 to see how common that name was and to see how it was distributed. The name turns out to be not very common at all. There's only 9 entries. And notice we have 2 groupings, one in Division 2 in Barron County and a second in Glasgow. The interesting thing I noticed about this group in Division 2 is that we have one adult, we have Nancy, and then we have a number of younger children. And so I begin to suspect that this may all be one family whose father has passed away. So looking at the 1840 census for Barron, Kentucky, I did a search for McMurray as a surname and only find one entry. So let's take a look at that household and compare it to that group that we had uncovered in the 1850 census living in Barron County. In 1840, James McMurray had one son aged 5 to 10. That would match James McMurray in the 1850 census, who is aged 15. He had 2 older sons, one of whom might have been that family in Glasgow. The younger son, William, being born after 1840, he doesn't show up in the 1840 census. We had the 2 younger girls, Mary 12 and Anne 10, who would match these 2 females under the age of 5. And then we have a female of age 5 to 10 that would match Nancy, who would have been around 8 at that period. Sally, 50, may have been just at the cusp of the age 30 to 40 in the 1840 census. Now this is beyond the research that John Colletta had done, but I wanted to show how you can correlate the information from the 1850 census and sometimes identify a possible family in an earlier census that only has tick marks. Now, we would certainly need to do some additional research before we could confirm that assumption that this is Nancy in her father's household, James McMurray and Sally. Now, what about that link to Joel Irwin? He's a person that needs to be explored as well. He may have records that provide some indication, some clues as to Nancy's origins. So, doing some research on him, for example, the website Find a Grave, while it did not have photographs of his gravestone, somebody has very kindly put up information about his marriages and records. Now, this would have to be verified, but here's an interesting thing. They say that his first marriage was to Helen P. Gassaway. That kind of nixes the idea that Nancy's relationship to Joel was as a sister-in-law, because Nancy's surname of McMurray doesn't match Helen's of Gassaway. Let's take a look for other records of McMurray's in Barron County, looking for marriages in particular, and we find here a marriage of a James McMurray in 1826 to his wife Ellen Gassaway. So this would suggest that Ellen Gassaway is connected to the Helen Gassaway, who was age 30 in the 1850 census. Helen Gassaway would be too young to be this same woman, but we can see the relationship with Joel Irwin comes through James McMurray's connection to Ellen Gassaway. I downloaded this information using the option to export to XLS. After I deleted empty columns, I parsed the columns so that I could sort by the year of marriage. And another interesting thing showed up. I find here in 1801 a Mary McMurray marrying a James Wood. Nancy's future husband was James Wood Parberry. So it looks like we have a very interconnected community of people. And that is such an important thing to remember when researching this time period. We take for granted today how easy it is to move across country when we forget that for people in this time period, in the early 1800s, moving across country meant building a road in some cases. They might have been moving into frontier land. There was no easy travel. Certainly when they reached their destination, there were not supermarkets that could provide them all the items they needed. They really relied on the people around them. And so they tended to move to places where they knew people, where they had a community already established, where they had bonds of friendship and family that would help ensure that they would be assisted when they needed it. If we wanted to continue this research, we have several individuals that we would want to continue to focus on to help explore Nancy's origins. The McMurrays, the Woods, the Parberrys, and the Gassaways would need to be explored. One piece of information that you get leads you to another and another and another. Two takeaways. One, a thorough, well-planned research, and two, paying attention to the details. We started, the only detail that we had about Dr. J.W. Parberry was that he was called doctor and he witnessed a fire. And from that, John was able to assemble an entire family history. We didn't answer all the questions. There's some questions we may never be able to answer. When did Nancy move to Alabama? Why did she leave Hart? Why did she move to Montgomery? What happened to John and Tyler, her other children? Not all questions are going to be possible to answer, but it is rather astonishing when you look at how much was able to be done on this family.